Welcome to Finance Malta and an opportunity to find out a little bit more about ESG. I'm Vanessa MacDonald, and here with me I have Paul Falzon, who's the Senior Regulatory Advisor at Ganado Advocates. Paul, we're talking a little bit about ESG in finance, and obviously this has now become mandatory. It's something we didn't even know about a decade ago, but it's become mandatory for regulated and listed companies. How has that affected Ganado's role in terms of the services that you offer?
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you for having me here. Now, as you rightly put it, if we look back 10 years ago, we had a number of entities who were already dealing with ESG, but dealing with it wasn't really mandatory. Now, since, 2-3 years ago, we've been having a lot of push from EU through the enactment of legislation whereby regulated entities and listed entities are now required to actually disclose certain aspects that they're doing in terms of ESG.
Basically, non-financial aspects.
Yes, non-financial.
Yeah.
I mean,
quite a difference when you think that nobody even knew what ESG stood for a few years ago.
Actually, we've seen a bit of a phenomenon in terms of the type of disclosures that we're seeing, because when it comes to financial disclosures, regulated entities and listed companies are more or less there. When we're dealing then with certain disclosures in terms of, the type of carbon emissions, the environmental aspects, social and governance aspects, there's a bit of an issue in terms of the type and quality of data that these listed companies and these regulated entities are including in their disclosures, because first of all, data is at this stage quite, I would say, scarce, and even the quality of data is not as good as the other type of financial data that they're used to. So we're seeing quite a bit of a heated debate, even internally in board meetings.
It must be really hard for them, Paul, because at the end of the day, you're talking about expertise on something which is actually so new. So you can't really expect companies to have that expertise, but...
Agreed. In fact, there are some entities who had actually started thinking about ESG for quite some time. So they've also had some individuals on boards, on investment committees who would be able to actually give quite valuable input in terms of type of investment, the type of product that they're offering to clients. But yes, even in terms of the knowledge out there, in terms of on the subject, is, I wouldn't call it limited, but it's still in its infancy.
It's still developing.
It's still developing. We're still seeing...
It hasn't been that long since we started talking about taxonomy and what is greenwashing and what isn't, etc.
Exactly. In fact, even from a legislative point of view, we're still seeing new laws being enacted and coming into effect, which are ultimately affecting licensed entities and regulated entities. So yes, we still, or rather, we need to keep reading. We need to keep learning about the topic, both from an industry point of view as well as from a regulator point of view. Because even when one looks at how different regulators are tackling the subject, one already notices certain discrepancies in terms of certain interpretations. So we're also seeing the EU issuing guidelines and issuing Q&As to try and streamline all the types of legislation and all the types of disclosures that one would need to make.
And that must be good news for Ganado, because obviously a lot of people need your services.
Yes, in fact, from our point of view, we've done quite a lot of work in terms of developing policies, developing type of disclosures that that regulated entities need to make. We've also engaged with the regulator because sometimes the regulator tends to see things from a theoretical point of view. We see things more both from a theoretical point of view and from a practical point of view.
Exactly, yes.
So that also helps the regulator to start gauging exactly what's happening in the industry, what obstacles the industry is facing, how we can tackle them, whether our approach is actually the right approach, because ultimately, given that it's a new regime, everything is still subject to interpretation. I'm happy to say that more or less we're in agreement with the regulator. So that gives me a bit of comfort that we're moving in the right direction, even in terms of internal knowledge, because we've been growing the team quite substantively, and even in terms of the various practices that we have. So insurance, investment services, capital markets, banking. It's still developing, but banks. I mean, when one speaks about banks, it's a whole different level, even in terms of
what they need to do, rather than
what they need to do, because it also.
But if they don't know how to do it for themselves, how on earth are they going to advise their clients? So that must be quite.
No, I mean,
quite a headache, no?
Things tend to be more, both from a disclosure point of view and in relation to banking, even in terms of how it's going to impact their balance sheet and their own funds. It's a whole different aspect from a banking perspective. You also mentioned greenwashing. Sometimes we also tend to see what we call green bleaching.
Oh.
So greenwashing is sort of having a product or marketing a product as an ESG product when in fact it's not. Green bleaching is the other way around. Not marketing the product in order for the licensed entity not to disclose what needs to be disclosed.
Oh.
So even
so you really need forensic skills to try and find these kind of things.
And that's where then ESG labeling and data comes in. Again, this is still developing, and we hope to be in a good position, even in terms of local industry and the global industry, to actually be able to classify products in the appropriate manner, because ultimately then we have, licensed entities have a fiduciary duty towards their end client, and it would be unwise for them to market a product in a way which might not be the proper product, you know.
Paul, I'm sure this is something we're going to be talking about an awful lot over the future. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you for having me.